The mining boomtown of Mazuma, Nevada was just reaching prosperity when it all came crashing down, quite literally. On a disastrously fateful day, not one, but two massive tidal waves of floodwaters would nearly wipe out the entire town, and take lives with it. Northern Nevada found itself more parched than usual in the spring of 1912. Ranchers and farmers throughout the region noted that less rain than expected graced the agricultural lands of the northern part of the state. While Nevada is high desert, part of the Basin and Range province, it normally sees enough rain and snow to support a modest amount of agriculture. This wasn't the case in 1912. It was so dry that hay growing season came to a premature end in late June. Normally, this crop is harvested much later in the summer, and sometimes even as late as very early fall. Always adaptable in the face of forces one cannot control, no one in the region expected much in the way of precipitation for the next several months. Much to the chagrin of the small mining town of Mazuma, this wouldn't be the case. Mazuma, Nevada sat at the mouth of Seven Troughs Canyon, a common geographic feature of deserts throughout the southwestern United States. Washes act as hydrological emergency relief valves. When major rainstorms deliver inches of rain in the span of an hour or less to mountains and hills, these washes channel that water to the plains below, where it eventually percolates into underground aquifers. Discovered and founded in the spring of 1906, the Seven Troughs mining district represented a bonanza gold strike. Though never as large as the infamous Comstock lode, sufficient mineral wealth attracted hundreds of miners, merchants, and their families to this desolate region some 30 miles northwest of present-day Lovelock, Nevada. This mining district sported multiple hotels, stores, assayers, blacksmiths, saloons, and even enjoyed being connected to the outside world via telephone.
Up here is the town, which would have been Seven Troughs. Now, I'm not sure if this is an old dam, or it looks like it could have been a dam, like they were trying to dam the area right here. Is the entire remnants of the town of Seven Troughs.
Founded a year later in 1907, Mazuma, despite its position at the bottom of a steep wash, sat in a prime location to support the mining and milling operations of the big mines in Seven Troughs Canyon.
These are the foundations of the old mill, of the Mazuma mill right here.
The terrain, relatively flat, afforded plenty of room for mills and support structures. Water proved to be sufficient, if not ample, for both domestic and industrial use, and the climate, while typical of Nevada, satisfactory. There's no record that anyone gave much or any thought to the fact that Mazuma had been platted and built at the mouth of what was clearly one of these major flood relief valves. The area had been so meticulously constructed and had evolved into a thriving community, complete with various residential and commercial structures, as pictured in this historical photo. However, in the blink of an eye, some 5 years after its birth, the booming town met its catastrophic end and was reduced to nothing but very few remnants of the life that had once been so vibrant. By some stroke of luck, from 1907 through July 17, 1912, Mazuma escaped the apparent perils of possible flood, but that wouldn't be the case for long.
So just to show how unpredictable the weather in the desert can be, and especially in the springtime, it was cloudy, but not really windy 10 minutes ago. And now it's hailing and raining. There is thunder coming over the mountains, and it's crazy.
July 18, 1912 probably dawned like most other days in northern Nevada. At first, there would have been a cool morning, likely with slightly higher than usual humidity. As the sun broke over the eastern peaks, the air would have gradually warmed, eventually carrying that morning humidity higher into the atmosphere. Eventually, that warm, moist air would contact a cooler layer of air many thousands of feet above the ground. In time, the moisture would condense into countless droplets, forming clouds. As the heat of the day increased, the updrafts of moist air would have accelerated, gaining greater velocity and transferring vast amounts of energy into the upper atmosphere. As every child knows, what goes up must come down, and on this day, it would come down with a vengeance. Eventually, the clouds would become saturated with moisture and cool enough to no longer contain the cloud-forming droplets. Each new raindrop would begin its return journey to the ground with a fury previously unseen in Mazuma. Most of the rain fell upslope from Mazuma, though enough fell on Mazuma proper as well. Above the Seven Troughs mines, thunder roared and lightning split the late afternoon skies, giving birth to a catastrophe. Just before dinner time on July 18th, William Wybark was driving up Seven Troughs Canyon on his regular mail delivery run in his Rio automobile. Down canyon in Mazuma, 3 of the 4 children of John and Mamie Kehoe played outdoors with their friend, 10-year-old Perry Gillespie. Just uphill of the Kehoe residence, local miner Jack O'Donnell was relaxing in his cabin, waiting for his dinner to finish cooking. Maud Raddell, Mazuma's postmistress, prepared to close the post office for the day while chatting with a few locals. Up the canyon, Ellsworth Bennett, a sayer, someone who tests metal for the Seven Troughs Coalition Mining Company, sat in the office of Ed Kallenbach, a company engineer. Apparently, they'd been discussing the brewing storm when their attention shifted to a loud rumbling sound. Tracing its origin with their eyes, their gaze landed upon a 10-foot-high wall of water racing down the canyon. Horrified by the sight, the water struck and destroyed a nearby cyanide plant. Cyanide is an incredibly toxic chemical used to extract gold from rock and must be treated with care. Even small amounts will cause health problems, even death. Now, 60 gallons of the deadly substance mixed in with the floodwaters and raced downhill towards Mazuma.
This is where the wall of water would have come straight down this way. I'm going to turn it around right now. What you're going to see, this was Seven Troughs up here. This was the town above it. This was the town that tried to warn them that a wall of water was coming. Somehow, a cloud burst up there and way up there caused a giant wall of water just to come right down this way here.
Kallenbach immediately grabbed his office telephone and tried to raise the alarm. He successfully notified the operator at the nearby town of Vernon, but when he tried to reach Mazuma, the conversation was mostly garbled due to atmospheric conditions, only getting out the word water. There would be no warning, no precious minutes afforded to alert anyone of the imminent danger. William Wybark saw the water coming towards him and veered his car up an embankment in the canyon just as the water struck. The raging waters flipped the Rio over, but a battered and bruised Wybark barely managed to climb out, make it up and out of the flood's path as the torrent carried the Rio downstream. To this day, small fragments of the car can still be found at the mouth of Seven Troughs Canyon and beyond. Further downstream, closer to Mazuma, the canyon begins to narrow. This twist of geologic fate would cause the wall of onrushing water to allegedly increase in height from about 10 feet to almost 20, according to eyewitness reports. As the flood entered Mazuma, the Kehoe home fell to the torrent, washing away 10-year-old Perry Gillespie, Mrs. Mamie Kehoe, and all 4 of the Kehoe children, including 1-year-old Ronald. Jack O'Donnell saw the water coming and ran down to grab little Ronald. O'Donnell became entrapped in the flood himself, still holding Ronald. Several more homes washed away in turn, with the waters finally reaching the post office. With a crash, the building collapsed on Mrs. Raddell, washing away Mazuma's postmistress and the debris of her post office.
Now, if you look up in the mountains, you can see what are old remnants and foundations of the old town. It ran up and down this entire, this is the mouth of the canyon, and the wall of water would have been coming straight down this canyon.
Further downstream, the Banquet Saloon, Mazuma Hills Saloon, and the Bank of Mazuma structures were all wiped off the canyon, but there had now been time enough for those furthest from the flood to evacuate. While the loss of property lower in the canyon was no less significant than that higher up the canyon, the loss of life proved not as extensive. The mouth of the canyon widens out into a broad open plain known as Sage Flat or Sage Hen Flat. At this point, the raging flood spent itself of its deadly energy, but still bore enough force to carry structures and debris miles out onto the plain.
So you can see there's a pretty good elevation change. Right, it gets steeper and it gradually flattens out. And so all that debris, all that water had to come down through there.
Accompanying the detritus of a once bustling town were the bodies of several Mazuma residents, including some of the Kehoe children. After the flood passed, dazed survivors began to wander around the canyon, looking for victims and generally dealing with the shock of the event. A few minutes after the water seemed to dissipate, a second wall of water came flying down the canyon. This time, the survivors were able to scramble out of harm's way and avoid being swept up in the second deluge. But this wave would push debris and some victims further into the plain below, making the eventual search and recovery efforts all the more challenging. Perhaps one of the saddest tales to come out of the Mazuma flood centers on the 4 Kehoe children. When the flood hit the Kehoe home, Mamie Kehoe and the 3 older Kehoe boys, 8-year-old Lewis, 6-year-old Cletus, and 4-year-old George, were all swept and thrown into the water. Lewis Kehoe managed to catch a large passing timber and used it as an improvised life raft, basically riding out the flood while clinging for dear life. Jack O'Donnell, who tried to snatch little Ronald Kehoe from the maw of death, became entangled in the flood himself, still clutching the child. O'Donnell managed to latch onto a piece of flotsam and ride the flood out into the plain. When the flood spit him up in the sagebrush below, O'Donnell was bruised and battered, suffering several broken ribs. Still clutched in his arms was a now deceased little Ronald Kehoe. O'Donnell, despite his best efforts, barely survived the ordeal himself, but could not save the 1-year-old.
When the flood hit the Kehoe home, Mamie Kehoe and the 3 older Kehoe boys, Lewis 8, Cletus 6, and George 4, were swept and thrown into the water. And that home would have been roughly center frame right now.
Lewis Kehoe fared far better, looking like so much of the soggy debris. There's no record as to how he was found, but Lewis would eventually go on to live a full life and relocate to California. As of 2012, at least one descendant of the Kehoe family, William J. Kehoe, son of Lewis Kehoe, was living somewhere in California. The bodies of Cletus, George, and Ronald were eventually recovered down on Sage Flat and buried in a small cemetery just below Mazuma. Many of the other deceased were taken to Lovelock, their bodies prepared for travel and returned to various parts of the United States for burial, including the body of 10-year-old Perry Gillespie. A good friend of the Kehoe children, he would not be buried next to them.
The problem is that the number of graves doesn't match the number of people who died in the flood, if only because a number of the bodies were shipped elsewhere in the United States to be buried closer to their ancestral homelands or their whatever family they had left, things like that. So it's a cemetery, but it's really not clear who's here. None of the markers have names on them. They've probably been destroyed and rebuilt dozens of times in the intervening century.
Mrs. Kehoe did not die in the flood. She was found alive but gravely injured. Initially treated in Mazuma, she was transported to Lovelock for more advanced medical care. While in Lovelock, her condition took a turn for the worse. Recognizing that the limited medical facilities in Lovelock were insufficient to treat Mrs. Kehoe, she was taken a few days later by train to Reno and admitted to St. George's Hospital. There she would remain on convalescence, her mother at her side for the next month. Accounts vary on this fact, but between 9 and 20 people suffered injuries in the flood. We can generally characterize the injuries into 2 classifications: those brought about by blunt force trauma caused by being rolled around in the floodwaters and beaten with large pieces of debris, and those close to the washed-out cyanide plant who suffered physical trauma as well as cyanide poisoning. Today, cyanide poisoning is treatable, but the mechanisms of the poisoning and how to treat it were not closely studied until 1929. At best, in 1912, physicians could only offer supportive therapy and had to wait for the chemical to be naturally cleared by the body. This often takes a long time, assuming the initial exposure didn't induce death. The suffering of cyanide victims is documented to be one of extreme agony, with seizures, loss of consciousness, fast heart rate, and cardiac arrest among the symptoms. For those who didn't perish in the flood, which accounts for 90% of the local population, food, water, and shelter were the main concerns. Word of the disaster reached Vernon from 7 Troughs by telephone, and the operator in Vernon called the Seven Troughs offices in Lovelock, Nevada, some 30 miles away. Within minutes, the first hastily organized relief parties left Lovelock for Mazuma, bringing whatever supplies could be gathered on short notice. But the response would not be rapid, as the road from Lovelock to Mazuma had been washed out in several places.
This would have been the old road going up. It's been completely washed out. You can see not much of a road left.
Many detours later, the first relief parties arrived on scene just before nightfall, accounting for time to survey the scene, understand the nature of the disaster, and organize searchers. Rescue efforts did not begin in earnest until darkness had settled on the little ruined mining town. In a callback to days of chivalry and civility, the women and children of Mazuma were offered refuge in Vernon and Seven Troughs, while the men worked to recover the dead and rescue the injured from a vast alluvial fan of mud and debris. The going would be tough, and expectations seemed to have been low for finding survivors. The only undamaged building in the canyon, Preston's Hotel, quickly found itself converted into both a hospital and temporary morgue. The first body to occupy the morgue was Maud Roddell's, the postmistress. Her lifeless form had been found 2 miles out into Sage Flat, and shortly after that, the bodies of James Kehoe and Perry Gillespie joined her. Late in the evening of July 18th, a telegram made its way to Governor Tasker Oddie in Carson City, apprising him of the situation and the need for assistance. Governor Oddie immediately began contacting prominent leaders throughout Nevada to organize a relief effort. Funds would be collected from prominent men like William Randolph Hearst and from everyday folks of limited means who nonetheless wanted to help. In the following week, significant sums of money would be raised to help the victims, based generally only on community donations. The Red Cross would assist in the relief efforts, but we should note that formal big government relief fund programs generally did not exist in 1912. This was a time when self-reliance and self-sufficiency were valued over handouts, and bureaucratic relief agencies were unimaginable. No disaster seems complete without at least one tale of looting, and the Mazuma flood proved no exception. When word of the flood reached Lovelock, Humboldt County Sheriff Graham Lamb accompanied the rescuers to Mazuma. Sheriff Lamb suspected that the devastation would be an open invitation to looters, and his hunch proved correct. 3 brothers, Charles, Bert, and Earl Simmons, had joined in to assist with the search and recovery efforts, but allegedly later broke off under cover of darkness to search abandoned homes and debris piles for valuables. Yet, when the Simmons brothers were apprehended inside an abandoned house, they were not in possession of any ill-gotten gains. The 3 were arrested, but the charges don't make sense in the historical record. They were charged with various forms of assault and battery, basically resisting arrest, but it's unclear what formed the basis for the initial arrest. Regardless of the questionable contact and ultimate arrests, the 3 were arraigned before local Justice of the Peace R.H. Young. Young declined to hear the case and instead ordered them immediately transported to Lovelock due to threats against their lives. The next morning, the Simmons brothers appeared before Lovelock's Justice of the Peace, Bert Hood, who refused to grant a trial by jury, receiving a sentence of 30 days in the Humboldt County Jail. Some problems apparently persisted with other looters, though no additional arrests were made. There was a suggestion that looters be dealt with by being shot on sight, but fortunately, cooler heads prevailed, and the idea quickly died out. Instead, a request was sent to Governor Oddie to send in Nevada State Police to ensure the peace and prevent further acts of looting. On July 29th, Bert Simmons retained the law firm of Salter and Robbins to appeal his conviction and those of his brothers. An application for a writ of habeas corpus was made on behalf of all 3 defendants, claiming that they had been denied the rights of counsel and a jury trial. The case was heard in Reno by Justice Thomas Moran, wherein Bert Simmons admitted on that stand that he and his brothers had never formally requested counsel. In the end, Justice Moran denied the request for the writ and remanded the brothers to the custody of Humboldt County Jail to serve out the rest of their 30-day sentences. If one visits the sites of Seven Troughs and Mazuma today, they will find only foundations, broken boards, twisted bits of tin and steel, and plenty of mine shafts.
The building materials they were using here looks like concrete, but then you have these big rocks that are all part of the, I guess you call it a conglomeration. Up here would have been some kind of building. There's a lot of artifacts up there. You can see them. Down here, what I thought was really cool is look at how there's this pipe It's taken out of the ground.
Mazuma, other than some concrete foundations and rusty scraps, was wiped off the face of the earth by the water.
And then the far side there and the rise in the middle are where Mazuma would have been. There's not much left as we got up close and looked, but even from this angle, it's very hard to tell, other than a few foundations, if there was any human habitation whatsoever.
Should you drive the old roads, the same ones that carried rescuers in 1912, a keen eye may notice one odd artifact. Near the mouth of Seven Troughs Canyon sits an enormous, doorless safe made of steel and lined with concrete.
The door was found missing when the safe came to rest down here. So that door would have been probably 10 inches thick, give or take. So it had to weigh hundreds of pounds, and it was just ripped clean off. And it's believed that this is the actual final resting spot within a few feet of where the safe actually ended up after the flood.
This safe probably weighs somewhere between 500 and 800 pounds. It's a remnant of the Seven Troughs Coalition Mining Company. The safe had originally been used to store gold bullion and concentrates, at the time of the flood containing about $10,000 of the precious metal, about $308,000 in modern dollars. That gold was lost in the flood, though corporate records suggest that most if not all of the gold was recovered and returned to the company treasury within a few months. Today, you can walk the same roads and climb the same hills that bore witness to the natural disaster of 1912. Your only company will be deer, antelope, rabbits, and perhaps the ghosts of those who perished in the Mazuma flood of 1912. Mazuma never recovered from the devastation. Though mining continued in Seven Troughs until the 1930s, many residents of Mazuma moved on to Rochester, a new and booming mining town a short drive up present-day Interstate 80.